I never thought betrayal could come from both sides. When it did, it felt like the earth cracked beneath me, swallowing everything I thought I knew. Jenna was my sister. My blood. The person I'd always trusted even when trust felt fragile. And Adam, he was the love I thought would last a lifetime. Their betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back. It was a carefully orchestrated dismantling of my life. And they had months to perfect it. It started innocuously, as these things often do. A misplaced phone. A pinging text message. I wasn't looking for anything. I never would have thought to question Adam, but fate, or cruelty, had other plans. The texts were unmistakable. I remember staring at the screen, the words blurring as my brain refused to process their meaning. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were full of secrets, confessions, moments that should have belonged to me. That night, I confronted Adam. I wanted him to deny it, to laugh and call me paranoid. But he didn't. His face crumpled. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just losing him. I had lost him long before. He said he loved me, but that Jenna understood him in a way I didn't. He said it like it was supposed to make sense, like I should nod and accept it. I didn't cry then. My tears came later, in the quiet of an empty apartment, as I replayed every moment of the last few months, finding betrayal hidden in places I hadn't thought to look. When I confronted Jenna, I didn't expect an apology. Jenna never apologized. But her audacity still shocked me. She said it wasn't her fault, that Adam pursued her, as though that absolved her of any guilt. She had always been good at spinning narratives, bending reality until it suited her. Growing up, Jenna was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She was the star of every family gathering, the one our parents doted on. I was the quieter one, the one who tried to stay out of her shadow. I see now that I spent my life trying to be someone Jenna couldn't dismiss. Leaving wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I packed my things, walked away from the life I'd built, and started over in a city where no one knew me. It was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into anything that could fill the void. Some days, the loneliness was overwhelming. Other days, I felt alive in a way I hadn't before. Slowly, I started to rediscover myself, piece by piece. But healing isn't linear. News of Jenna and Adam's breakup reached me through a mutual friend, and I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. Jenna's life, once so perfect, was falling apart. It should have felt like justice, but it didn't. Instead, it reminded me of how much I had lost, how much we all had lost. When I ran into Jenna months later, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. She tried to apologize, but her words were hollow. Her excuses tired. I didn't need her apology anymore. I didn't need anything from her. For the first time, I realized I was free. Now, I'm building a life that feels like mine. I've found someone who sees me, who values me for who I am. My family and I are finding our way back to each other. Though I've learned to set boundaries, to protect myself, I no longer measure my worth against Jenna's shadow or Adam's indifference. I've found peace. Not because of them, but in spite of them. The fault line in my life didn't break me. It revealed the strength I didn't know I had. And for that, I am grateful. As I moved forward, life began to take on a new rhythm, one dictated by my choices, not the remnants of what Adam and Jenna had left behind. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to someone else's needs or expectations. My days became my own. And while that freedom was exhilarating, it also felt unfamiliar. Like learning to walk again, after being immobile for so long. I started to lean into art. Something I hadn't pursued since high school. There was a dusty, half-used sketchbook I found while unpacking in my tiny new apartment. And on a whim, I opened it. The blank pages stared back at me. And I almost closed it. But instead, I let myself draw. At first, the lines were hesitant. The images unremarkable. But as days turned into weeks, the sketchbook became my confidant. Each page absorbed my anger, sadness, and confusion. Over time, the lines became bold, the colors vivid. I was painting my pain. But I was also painting my healing. Work at the nonprofit helped too. It wasn't glamorous grant writing, organizing events, and managing endless emails, but it was meaningful. Seeing the direct impact of what we did gave me perspective. There was something grounding about helping people who needed support. About stepping out of my own heartbreak to be there for others. It reminded me that the world was vast and full of stories. Many more painful than my own. Of course, there were still moments when my past felt close enough to touch. On quiet nights, I'd think about Jenna. I'd picture her at family dinners. Her laugh dominating the room. Her charm drawing everyone in. I wondered if she missed me. If she regretted what she'd done. It was a futile line of thought. But sometimes, it was hard to stop. And then there was Adam. His absence was less visceral. More like a dull ache. Occasionally, I'd catch myself wondering if he'd ever loved me at all, or if I'd been nothing more than a placeholder. But I realized that those questions didn't need answers. They belonged to a past I was no longer a part of. Months turned into a year. And one day, as I sat in a crowded cafe working on sketches for an upcoming community mural project, someone asked if they could share my table. I looked up and saw a man about my age, carrying a laptop and a cup of coffee that seemed moments away from spilling. He had an easy smile. The kind that didn't feel forced. I nodded. And he sat down, offering a quick thanks before diving into his work. For the next hour, we sat in companionable silence. Until he noticed my sketches and complimented them. That was how I met Noah. He wasn't like Adam. He didn't sweep me off my feet with grand gestures or intoxicating charm. Instead, he was steady, thoughtful, and kind. We started seeing each other casually at first, coffee here, a walk there, but over time, it grew into something more. Noah didn't try to fix me or fill the cracks in my life. Instead, he held space for me, allowing me to exist as I was. Flaws and all. It was a kind of love I hadn't known before. One that felt like a warm embrace rather than a consuming fire. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family began to mend. Though it was a slow and careful process. My mother and I had a long conversation one evening during a visit back home. She admitted that she had always leaned on Jenna more because Jenna demanded it. But that doesn't mean I didn't see you. Honey, she said. Her voice thick with emotion. I just didn't know how to show you. It wasn't a perfect apology. But it was honest. And I could feel the sincerity in her words. For the first time, I saw her not as my mother, but as a woman who had her own struggles and blind spots. Forgiveness didn't come easily. But I was learning that it wasn't about excusing the past. It was about releasing its hold on me. The real test came when I was invited to a mutual friend's art gallery opening. I almost didn't go, knowing Jenna might be there. But I refused to let her presence dictate my choices anymore. When I saw her across the room, she looked the same, but different. There was a tension in her smile, a fragility I hadn't noticed before. She approached me hesitantly, and for a moment, we stood in awkward silence. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation around us. "For everything." I wanted to believe her, but the years of manipulation and betrayal made it hard. "Still," I nodded. Not because I forgave her fully, but because I was ready to let go. I didn't need an apology to move on, but hearing it felt like closing a chapter. As I walked out of the gallery that night, I felt lighter. The weight of their betrayal no longer pressed on my shoulders. It had shaped me, yes, but it didn't define me. I had built something new, something strong, out of the rubble they left behind. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt. But I faced them with a sense of clarity and resilience I hadn't known before. I was no longer the girl who bent over backward to keep the peace, to avoid confrontation. I was a woman who knew her worth and demanded better, not just from others, but from herself. As I sat in my apartment one evening, sketching ideas for a new series, Noah's voice broke through my concentration. "You look happy," he said, leaning against the doorway with a small smile. "I think I am," I replied, realizing it was true. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because of anyone else, but because of me. The fault line in my life had shifted, but it hadn't swallowed me. Instead, it had revealed a stronger, brighter version of myself. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful ending of all. Months turned into years, and the cracks that once threatened to break me became scars visible. Yes, but no longer painful. They were reminders of where I'd been, of the strength it took to rebuild my life from the ground up. They were part of me, but they didn't define me. Noah and I moved in together after 2 years of dating. It wasn't rushed or impulsive. By then, we knew each other well enough to understand what we were stepping into. Our apartment was small, but filled with warmth, an eclectic mix of his books and my sketches, plants we both forgot to water, and the lingering scent of his Sunday morning pancakes. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it felt like home in a way I hadn't experienced before. My art had also grown beyond what I ever imagined. What started as a way to process my pain turned into a calling. The nonprofit I worked for offered me a chance to lead a community art initiative, and I poured my heart into it. Murals began to dot the city, each one telling a story of resilience, of hope, of transformation. It wasn't just my story anymore, it was the stories of everyone who had ever felt broken and fought their way back. One day, while Noah and I were walking through the neighborhood, admiring one of the murals I'd designed, he stopped and turned to me. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" he asked, his tone soft, almost reverent. I did. Often. The journey wasn't something I took for granted. "I do," I said, squeezing his hand. "And I don't think I'd change any of it." That was the truth. Even the betrayal, the heartbreak, the loneliness, it had all brought me to this moment. It had taught me how to value myself, how to recognize love that was real, and how to let go of what no longer served me. It had shaped me into the woman I was. Standing there with Noah, feeling not just happy but content. But life, as it always does, had one more test for me. It came in the form of a phone call one rainy afternoon. I was at my studio, working on a piece for an upcoming exhibit, when my phone buzzed. Seeing my mother's name on the screen, I answered, expecting the usual update on her garden or a request for tech support. Instead, her voice was strained, trembling. "It's Jenna," she said. "She's in the hospital." My heart sank. I hadn't spoken to Jenna in years, not since the gallery opening where we exchanged that tentative truce. We'd drifted back into silence after that, neither of us making an effort to reconnect. But hearing her name, hearing that she was unwell, stirred something in me I couldn't ignore. "What happened?" I asked, already grabbing my coat. "She had a bad fall," my mother explained. "She's been struggling more than she let on." By the time I reached the hospital, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, anger, concern, they all swirled together, leaving me raw and unsteady. When I walked into her room, I barely recognized her. The vibrant, confident sister I'd known was gone, replaced by someone who looked frail, almost fragile. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. I didn't know what to say, and neither did she. So I sat down and held her hand. The silence between us heavy, but not unbearable. Over the next few days, I learned the extent of Jenna's struggles. The life she'd so carefully curated, the one that always seemed perfect from the outside, had crumbled. Financial troubles, failed relationships, and health issues had taken their toll. She had been too proud to ask for help. And now, here she was, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't easy, but I stayed. I helped her with paperwork, talked to her doctors, and even brought her meals when she was discharged. It wasn't forgiveness. Not entirely. But it was compassion. And it was something I needed as much as she did. In the weeks that followed, Jenna and I began to rebuild something resembling a relationship. It wasn't the close bond we once had, but it was real, honest. She apologized again, this time with no excuses. And I told her the truth, that I had moved on, that I didn't need her to fix the past, but that I appreciated her trying. When she hugged me for the first time in years, I let her. Years later, as I sat in a gallery filled with my artwork, surrounded by friends, family, and strangers who had come to see my story laid bare on the walls, I realized something profound. Life is messy. People are flawed. But even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. Jenna was there that night, standing in the back of the room with a shy smile. Noah was beside me, his hand warm on my shoulder. My mother beamed with pride. And even my father, who rarely showed emotion, looked impressed. The people I loved and some I had forgiven were all there. And that was enough. When the evening wound down, Jenna approached me. She didn't say much, just that she was proud of me, and that she was glad I hadn't given up on her. I smiled, knowing that while we'd never be the sisters we once were, we were something better, two people who had faced the worst and come out stronger. As I looked around the gallery one last time, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The fault lines in my life hadn't just mended, they had become part of the foundation. They were proof that I had survived, that I had grown, that I had lived. And for the first time, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving.